Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.
Hi, I'm Tricia Klass. Today I'm talking with Nicholas Hartlep, professor in the Educational Administration and Foundations Department. Dr. Hartlep teaches courses in social foundations of education. The article we will discuss, Asian Pacific College Freshman Attitudes about the Abolishment of Affirmative Action in College Admissions, is the topic of discussion. Welcome, Nicholas. Thank you for talking with me.
Thanks for having me.
Can you define the model minority stereotype about Asian Pacific Americans and explain how that stereotype affects this population in relation to belief about affirmative action?
Sure. The model minority stereotype asserts that Asian Pacific Americans are uniquely successful. Their success is typically thought to be in terms of academic achievement and attainment. For instance, high GPA, SAT scores, national merit scholarships, what have you. Moreover, Asian Pacific Americans compared to Hispanic and Blacks are uplifted as models of how individual effort leads to success in a meritocratic society. Culturally speaking, the characteristics of this stereotype are assimilating into the dominant society, being passive or quiet, or exhibiting humility and meekness. However, this positive construction invariably leads to overlooking many struggling Asian Pacific American students. So a negative consequence of this stereotype is the needs of these Asian Pacific Americans go unmet. Also important to mention is that a preponderance of research has found that this stereotype of success places incredible and unhealthy pressure on Asian Pacific American students to be successful. And in some extreme cases, when and if these students are not perceived as, they don't believe they're successful as they should be, they've actually taken their own lives. So consequently, suicide is a problematic shadow that seems to follow this positive stereotype. Also, many Asian Pacific Americans have internalized this stereotype to the point that some have bought into the logic that, meritocracy is real and exists. So in other words, some Asian Pacific Americans claim that affirmative action actually harms their academic chances. And so the scholarly word we use for this is negative action, or the belief that affirmative action reduces the likelihood an Asian Pacific American student will be accepted into a prestigious college and or university. And so, therefore, it could be argued with reasonable ease that the model minority stereotype is intricately related to Asian Pacific Americans' attitudes towards affirmative action. If Asian Pacific Americans believe that negative action is real and racism is unreal, they will be more susceptible to possessing negative attitudes toward affirmative action, in which case they will likely support its abolishment in college admissions. Conversely, if Asian Pacific Americans believe that affirmative action is necessary due to racism being real and negative action doesn't exist, it stands to reason then that they'll be in opposition to its abolishment in college admissions. So in summary, I would just say that the model minority stereotype affects the Asian Pacific American population and is related to their beliefs about affirmative action.
And in your literature review, you cite numerous research studies related to affirmative action in general and about Asian Pacific American attitudes towards affirmative action in particular. What are the major facts known about this in the research, and what are the gaps where future research can make a contribution?
There's three things that we kind of know. First is historically the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action have been white women, not to be confused with the misconception that minorities are the largest recipients. Second, we know that affirmative action is being under assault nationally. So we have the Abigail Fisher case we can cite, the Allenbaki case, in which case both plaintiffs were white. Abigail Fisher, a female, and Allenbaki, a male. And third, the literature, although it's somewhat mixed, I guess there is a kind of this trend or belief that Asian Pacific Americans tend to endorse attitudes towards affirmative action that more closely resemble Latinos and Blacks. And there's also convincing support that political affiliation and income levels influences their attitudes towards affirmative action, meaning that it's not an ethnic or racial issue per se. So, the more income you have, more prone to wanting to get rid of affirmative action and, again, partisan politics. So those three things we kind of know.
And then your study goes beyond that, and I think it talks to what hypothesis you were testing. Why was it important to test two different interactions or moderating effects related to racism and meritocracy in understanding attitudes toward affirmative action?
Yeah, that's a great question. So racism arguably has become more closeted. So in other words, racism is much more invisible than in times past. Many citizens would like to believe that America has become post-racial. I mean, we re-elected a black president, didn't we? So this evidence that they use, post-racialism, is a reality that research must take into consideration. Also, racism and meritocracy are important concepts and constructs to examine coterminously because Asian Pacific American meritocratic adherents may believe that society should operate in a colorblind fashion, thus not supporting race-conscious affirmative action policies in higher ed. So, based on the review of the literature, it appears that beliefs about racism as well as beliefs about meritocracy are associated with Asian Pacific Americans' attitudes toward affirmative action. Since racism ideology and meritocratic ideology coexist, it was important to test interaction and/or moderating effects related to racism and meritocracy in order to better understand APA student freshman attitudes towards affirmative action.
And what are your major conclusions related to beliefs about meritocracy, racism, and abolishment of affirmative action for Asian Pacific Americans?
Sure. So readers, as they know, we use data from the UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute's 2007 freshman survey. And so with that data, we tested a moderation model. And so meritocracy was predicted to influence attitude towards abolishment of affirmative action in college admissions. But the belief in racism was predicted to influence or moderate this latter relationship also. And so we hypothesized that racism ideology, or the degree to which one believes that racism does or does not exist, moderates the association between bootstrap ideology, which is the degree to which one believes that meritocracy does or does not exist, and attitude towards affirmative action in college admissions. This is exactly what we found. So in other words, our findings suggest that if an Asian Pacific American college freshman believes racism still exists, they're more likely to be against the abolishment of affirmative action in college admissions. Whereas if an Asian Pacific American freshman does not believe that racism still exists, they are more likely to be in support of its abolishment. Further, when taking into consideration meritocratic logic, this relationship is stronger.
And that leads to a lot of interesting implications for practice and future research. Can you talk about what you believe are the important implications for practice and future research?
Yeah, so we intentionally use this data source because we believe college freshmen are an important population to study and to teach. And so something practical we could take from this study is the importance of teaching students, college students, about the realities of affirmative action. There's a lot of myths out there, the model minority stereotype being one of them. But another is that we need to educate all students, whether they're black, white, Latino, all students, about affirmative action. And there's a lot of research that documents the benefits of supporting diversity measures and affirmative action policies. And so I would just say that we need to talk about affirmative action and not just simply say, oh, that's a quota, which is incorrect. Quotas are not used.
And what are some of your future research studies tied into this?
So I'm going to be presenting a form of this paper at the Korean Association of Multicultural Education Conference in May this year. And again, working with a colleague at Baylor, similar types of models, but using other data. And so this was a moderation model. We're looking at using finite mixture models and other categorical analyses. So there's a lot of need for this type of research, especially with Asian Pacific Americans as the analytic sample.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure today's brief conversation will encourage others to read your article, and it sounds like future ones that expand or enhance this. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
The full citation of the study is Hartlep, Ecker, Miller, and Whitmore, 2013. Asian Pacific American College Freshmen, Attitudes Towards the Abolishment of Affirmative Action in College Admissions. Published in Critical Questions in Education, Volume 4, Number 1, pages 1 to 20. The citation can also be found on our website, coe.ilstu.edu/research/podcasts. Join us for future Research Break podcasts.
This podcast is sponsored by Illinois State University's College of Education, where we strive to assure that all students realize the democratic ideal through our teaching, research, and service to the field of education.